Hey everybody, welcome to the Otherppl podcast, a weekly program featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. My name is Brad Listi. I'm in Los Angeles. It's good to be with you. I appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to this program wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Bluesky. So my guest today is Max Porter, author of a novel called Shy.
The diagnostic language, or the language of a recovery from certain mental states back to a place of normality, or what does that mean? Fit for purpose for the social or economic activities of well-adjusted, 21st century life. That isn't something that means anything to the unhappy teenager, nor does it really mean anything to me in terms of what is interesting about the human mind. I reject it as a mode of obedience. I think that the interesting action is happening where the path doesn't tread in that regard. But I also think that there is a thing about that every generation does, which is, and I think we're particularly guilty of it now with millennials. Some of the language that the kind of boomer generation has around millennials and their mental health struggles is deeply patronizing, and suggests that the kind of provocations of youth culture, or like yet again we're writing it off as not valid according to our established ones. And I wanted Shy to be not sophisticated in his formulation of resistance against that, but more a kind of belch, a kind of physical or a scatological, almost a kind of vomiting or shitting of the body. And I'm interested in I guess people like Artaud and the theatre of the absurd, and a physical rejection of it.
Okay, that was Max Porter. His latest novel is called Shy, and it is available now in trade paperback in the United States of America from Graywolf Press. Shy tells the story of a troubled teenage boy who is struggling with severe mental illness. In the pages of this book, he wanders into the night listening to the voices in his head. Voices of teachers, his parents, the people he has hurt, and the people who are trying to love him. Shy is trying to escape a place called Last Chance, a home for disturbed young men. This is a lyrical, even musical, and very affecting book. I had a great conversation with Max Porter, who is appearing on this program for a second time. You will hear us in conversation in just a bit. A reminder that I do a weekly email newsletter. You can sign up over at bradlisti.substack.com. I would love it if you did. I would also love it if you joined the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. Today's episode is brought to you by Alfred A. Knopf, publisher of the novel We Were the Universe, the debut by Kimberly King Parsons and the official June pick of my book club. We Were the Universe is an outstanding novel. It's ambitious, it's inventive, it is revelatory, a fearless exploration of sisterhood, grief, motherhood, friendship, marriage, psychedelics, and the many strange and transcendent shapes that love can take. What more do you want from a book? Jenny Offel calls We Were the Universe, quote, a wrenchingly honest novel full of dark wit and feral delight about a new mother navigating the trippy, uncharted wilderness between love and grief. Once again, the book is called We Were the Universe, the debut novel by Kimberly King Parsons, available now from Knopf. All right, so my guest once again is Max Porter. His latest novel is called Shy, now available in trade paperback in the United States from Graywolf Press. Max Porter is the author of Lanny, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize. Another book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers, winner of the International Dylan Thomas Prize. And a third book called The Death of Francis Bacon. He lives in England with his family, and I'm very pleased to have him back here on this show. to talk with me about his latest novel. So let's get to today's conversation. Here I am with Max Porter, and his new book, one more time, is called Shy.
I was working on a couple of other things. I was writing a play. I had binned a couple of projects that, for various reasons, I'm not afraid of binning a project. If something's not working, I'll stick it in the drawer. I'll leave it alone, or I'll believe someone that tells me it's not working. I'm quite responsive to feedback in that way. And then I had several. Well, I guess just to go back even before that, I'd been working with young people. At the end of the pandemic, I'd been mentoring young people, and it had been revelatory for me, or it had clarified for me how long it's been since I was a young person, or some of the ways that I'd, like I teach in prisons and stuff like that, and I had slightly forgotten what an extraordinary and clarifying experience it is to be around other people trying to explain what literature is and what reading is, when their idea of it is very different to your own, or whether their receptiveness to it is like profoundly other to one's own. So I had been excited by this and wanted to like get back into the mind of teenagers a little bit. So that had been bubbling along, and I tried it in a medieval context. I'd started a book about a medieval manuscript illuminator who was discovering within himself a secular feeling. And then I did have a very strange experience in some haunted woods near me. I won't bore you with the long story, but every time I go there, something weird happens, genuinely weird. And I've taken other people there to act as a witness, and something weird has happened with them. And it turns out that these woods are authentically haunted. I think they're known as the 8th most haunted place in Britain.
And yet you keep going to these woods.
Yeah. My dog is always really weirded out, and my dog responds badly to the woods. Poets. I've taken poets to the woods, and poets are more receptive to its supernatural capabilities than civilians. But anyway, I'd had a strange time there with my kids, and then I dreamt of the woods, of those same woods that a child, a kind of notional autobiographical sort of cipher of myself was in those woods and was transparent. The membrane between him and the woods was non-existent, so things passed through him. And that struck me as an interesting idea as a literary device, but also as a way of doing character. So then that's when I rushed. I had this sense suddenly of this boy who was going from one place to another, and it would be and the book would move at the speed of his thought. And that also interested me from a stylistic point of view.
So I have to ask, what happened to you in these woods, like in these haunted woods?
I mean, I could give you like a top 10, because every time I go there, something odd happens. The most baffling thing for me is that every time I go there appears to be other human presences in the wood, and then you go to that presence and there's nothing there. So the first time it was smoke, there was a fire, and I said to my kids, look, someone's having a fire. There must be some kind of campsite in the woods. Let's go over there. And there was no, we followed the smoke. And then when we got to where the smoke had been, there was no smoke, or there is no smoke without fire. There was neither smoke nor fire. As my children are my witness to this, it was really weird. My youngest child was upset by it. On another occasion, this is the one that I talk about a lot, because it seems to me as almost like a kind of, almost as a kind of Doom mod, like those people that modify Doom. My brother was telling me yesterday, someone's modified Doom along the lines of House of Leaves. They've done a House of Leaves mod of Doom as an elegy for their best friend that died, based on his childhood home. And that's like music to my ears. I think that's the most fantastic thing. But this experience of the ghost in the woods was sort of modified to my own, the self-absorption of the novelist or whatever, because I left my children in the car because they didn't want to go into the haunted woods again. I went into the haunted woods to this extraordinary beech tree. And this beech tree is like a queen of the forest. It's huge. And it's probably that every other tree in that forest would have been blown down in the hurricane of 1987 here. But that one survived it. So it's a sort of 400-year-old tree among 30-year-old trees. It's a beast. And I walked around it, and my dog started going, and carved very, very freshly into the bark of the tree was the word Max. Very freshly,
Jesus.
like it was bleeding. It was completely fresh. The bark was like freshly exposed, hadn't even started greening. So that was a bit odd.
Yeah.
And I've been back.
How do you
We could do
respond?
this
How do you
all evening, right? I
respond
could
to
just keep
this?
on telling you these stories. When I went back, I sort of, I sort of like, go, let me get out of here and I'll write another book. But I took my wife to show her this because she's like, bullshit, I want to see it. And I took her back, showed her the word Max. She's like, yeah, that must have been quite weird. And then on the tree, the fallen branch next to the tree, it said M and J, which is our initials. So it's as if there is a sort of previous or not yet experienced life in which we are going there and leaving these marks.
Wow.
That kind of stuff, yeah.
I mean,
Worley
that
Woods,
gives me the chills to think about that because
yeah.
I'm skeptical. I tend to be skeptical of supernatural claims just because I've never seen a
Mm,
ghost. Like this stuff doesn't come to
mm,
visit me. But
mm.
I hear stuff like this and it
Well,
gives me pause.
England is a very haunted place, and I'm not a great believer in the supernatural, but I'm a huge believer in hauntings. I think we are being haunted. I think that the capability, like, as neurosurgeons, as neuroscientists are starting to work out, like the brain is a hauntological weapon. Like we are only using a tiny amount of our brain, and the more we would use, the more we would discover the ways in which our language is itself a remnant of something that's previously existed or is being bombarded by human and non-human things outside of our conscious control. And this country being small and so claustrophobic and layered with different types of history, I believe that it's more possible to get those sorts of energies off a place. That's particularly in terms of the architectural uncanny. Like those woods, for example, there's an Iron Age burial fort there, where people were buried eight to 10,000 years ago. Then there's a Roman settlement. Then there's a Tudor house. Then there's a Victorian, insane asylum. Then there's a 20th century school for naughty boys. Then there's a 21st century campsite. I'm a believer that some kind of psychic energy is left over from these things, that would impact upon us in some way,
Yeah, I can buy that.
even in subtle ways. Yeah. So it's not like I'm particularly like ghost hunter general, but I'm interested in it psychically. There's a Victorian guy who I was interested in last year who developed a theory called tape. I think it's called tape memory theory or something, which suggests that like an old audio cassette, human experience and a particularly emotional experience leaves a mark on the tape, and that mark is palpable or can be felt by future people in the same space, whether that be violence or yeah. So say for example you're in a room where horrible things were done 100 years ago, not necessarily that you would immediately feel, oh, I'm in a horrible place or I'm unhappy in this space, but there will be some kind of psychic impact or glitch or echo upon. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in that, and that was one of the reasons why Shy was acted upon by the people that had been in the space previously, because I sort of thought I wanted his consciousness to be edgeless and other people's consciousness, both human and animal, to sort of flow and ebb into him. And how would that? I guess I wasn't so much interested in that as a plot device as a stylistic one. Like how would that look on the page? How would I do that?
Yeah, I want to talk to you about this movement from the experience in the woods, the dream that you had, to the creation of Shy, the protagonist of your novella, who is on the page incredibly unique. I don't think I've encountered a character quite like Shy in the way that he's rendered. Like all of the experiences that he has are rendered through the lens of his memory, his like kind of staccato thought patterns. I have to believe there was a trial and error process that you went through to
Mm,
arrive
mm.
at what ultimately ends up in the book. Can you talk a little bit about Shy, who he is, and how you worked creatively to create him on the page in the way that you did?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the trial and error is really in the collage of what I'm including or not including. So I don't tend to write large sections or unbroken sections of prose and then weed it away. I tend to write in a fragmentary manner and then juxtapose the different elements I've got. So really, it was a question of what what sequence works in terms of inclusions and what works to create what I call across all my work, but particularly this book, a kind of fixation of mine, is the juxtapositional energies between the components. So that it's not A and B; it's what happens for the reader in the in the journey between A and B. So really, for me, I would realize that something was familiar or underwhelming in terms of its sonic or emotional or narrative effect, and therefore I would move it or try it somewhere else. So I think it's interesting. Like, this is something I've been doing since my first book. So to have something relatively sentimental or certainly interrogative of a sentimental mode next to something very, very like a found object next to something really calibrated in terms of its like philosophical or socioeconomic purpose in the book, in the fabric of the book, and really you have a completely different book depending on what order you put those things. So for me, this was a very editorial project. I wrote it fast and then edited it again and again and again and again to try and get this storm that is the collage of Shai's sense of self and other people's sense of him and his experiences, to get it moving or humming, like vibrating in the way I wanted it to vibrate. And so that was, yeah, reordering a lot, taking out anything that was in a kind of novelistic mode. I don't want to sound disparaging or uninterested in the social realist novelistic mode as is utilized by most novelists, but it didn't work here. There was no place for it here, really. Anything that was me saying from the vantage point of a 42-year-old novelist how I felt about childhood, or trying to shape or massage my characters into being think thinkers and speakers of thoughts I might have, was just hideous in the mix. Like, I was allergic to it, so I had to take it out and think what's happening in Shai's brain, or what would be the vernacular for Shai to experience this, or so it was a question of removing and reordering.
Something about this book that really strikes me is how deft it is at portraying a very complicated psychology. And I want to say there was a review that I read by Hermione Hobie wherein it was pointed out that the book's true setting is the shifting terrain of Shai's mind. I don't know if that's how you see it, but that's squared with my experience of reading the book, where you're really, as a reader, learning how to navigate this character's mind and the very specific and unique ways in which it operates. Does that do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I remember that review, and I think it's a really beautiful and elegant piece of criticism. I what I am interested in is with Shai is the weather system of his own mind, and that necessarily can't be ordered in the novelistic way between the present and flashbacks to his recent past or whatever. It needs to be jumbled, and it needs to have unexpected, uh, catastrophic pitfalls, like errors, glitches, and also it needs to have the kind of ecstatic uplift of his enthusiasms as well. One of the things I was most keen on writing about an unhappy person, and indeed a suicidal person, was to have his joy in the mix, because I think without the joy, it's very, very difficult to contextualize or truthfully interrogate the despair. So yeah, I hope it feels like being in someone's mind much more than being in a novelist's built world.
I wanted to ask you a question about suicidality and self harm, which is a big theme in this book and which is something that Shai is facing as he goes on. I guess you would call it a night walk. That's really what this book, in terms of its movement through physical space, is mostly about. It's about Shai out and about on his own. in the English countryside at night and entertaining thoughts of self-harm. And I'm going to quote you to yourself. I read in an interview that you did where you said, I wanted to take teenage mental health as seriously as possible. I didn't want to belittle the suicidal impulse. I wanted to flood the novel with the idea that it's fine, not fine in a way that enables Shai to hurt himself, but in a way that proposes that he is understood, that his desire isn't a passing fad, and that he might live with it forever. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on this part of the book? And I think it's related to some of the volunteer work that you mentioned a bit ago that you had been doing with teenagers.
Yeah, thank you for asking me to speak to this. I worry that in the language around self-harm and suicide, we are sometimes using vocabularies or moral imperatives taken from religious thought, sometimes more often than not in this country from the kind of the legacy of Christianity, in which suicide is a sin, but also I think from a kind of capitalist mentality whereby the diagnostic language or the language of a recovery from certain mental states back to a place of normality, or what does that mean? Fit for purpose for the social or economic activities of well-adjusted, 21st century life. That isn't something that means anything to the unhappy teenager, and nor does it really mean anything to me in terms of what is interesting about the human mind. I reject it as a mode of obedience. I think that the interesting action is happening where the path doesn't tread in that regard. But I also think that there is a thing about that every generation does, which is, and I think we're particularly guilty of it now with millennials. Some of the language that the kind of boomer generation has around millennials and their mental health struggles is deeply patronizing, and suggests that the kind of provocations of youth culture, or like yet again we're writing it off as not valid according to our established norms. And I wanted Shai to be not sophisticated in his formulation of resistance against that, but more a kind of belch, a kind of physical or a scatological, almost a kind of vomiting or shitting of the body. And I'm interested in, I guess, people like Artaud and the theatre of the absurd, and a physical rejection of it, but also one that is pre-linguistic, and therefore he is never very eloquent about how he's feeling. Others do that for him, which is why I also introduce a non-human cameo in order to evoke from him a potential movement forward outside of ideas of recovery or medicinal solutions or therapeutic solutions given to him by others, but a semi-mystical insight that is gifted to him by a non-human character in order that he might see a path forward that is entirely bespoke for him, not borrowed from the culture, and certainly not borrowed from pharmaceutical or psychoanalytic paradigms that the people around him have been using. He's very lucky to have a nice therapist. He's very lucky to have a good teacher. But those psychological or pedagogical frameworks are worse than useless. They're prisons into which he is thrown. So this 3 hour period, 4 hour period in his life is an attempt to break out of that prison. And rather than that just be ugly or violent, I want it to be hopeful in the kind of Rebecca Solnit formulation of hope, that the mystical encounter is an axe with which he might break through the door of his own unhappiness. And I think I that's one of the reasons I said it in 1995, because that is before a certain tendency to diagnose had become mainstream, but also before mobile phones, in which I think the language, the communal language of unhappiness or bullying or indeed like cultural identity has just so profoundly changed. So that's one of the reasons I did that, is sort of to kind of retrofit this boy with a distinctly late 20th century unhappiness. And that was interesting because I was a fairly okay as a kid about Shy's age, but I was close to and knew a lot of people that weren't. So from an emotional and creative point of view, to burrow back into other people's unhappiness and try and sound it out without the vocabulary that I would use for my own children or my friends now, to try and do it on a kind of emotional level, and find that I couldn't do that as Shy. That was hollow. That was artificial. I couldn't do it as myself. So I had to use the voice. I had to do it on the lateral axis. I had to pack it in using his bullies, his girlfriend, his peers, his teachers. And that was, from a sort of sonic point of view, sonic collage point of view, that was really interesting and rewarding. And I felt like I was, I felt like something was happening around him, in him, to the side of him, rather than being placed onto him by my vertical ownership of him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a book that very much teaches you how to read it as you go. Like, there's visual things happening on the page with respect to the different fonts, font sizes. You do at certain turns some creative things with enlarged text that spreads from one page to the next in a fragmentary way. It's kind of hard for listeners probably to grapple with it, because you sort of have to see it and experience it and read it to fully get it. But those are very like courageous, creative choices. They're innovative in terms of the way in which you are employing those things to render in a sophisticated manner the very unique psychology of this character and the ways in which his memories interact with his lived experiences and thoughts in the present. I mean, it's delicate, right? And I am the parent of a child with, disabilities and very unique psychology. And so this book resonated with me on that level, because what you learn when you are a parent to such a child, or you are involved in any capacity in life with people who are traveling this road, is how unique each of these people and each of their particular situations are, right? Their wiring is also, there's not a one size fits all for people who have a different
No.
mental, psychological experience of existence in the manner that a guy like Shy does. So, that's kind of like, I think, multiple questions at once. Like, why don't we start with the typesetting, the text, the ways in which you figured out creatively how to bring in these other characters and memories in a way that felt authentic and not a disservice to the authenticity of Shy.
Well, one of my preoccupations in that regard would be the erasure of myself. So I give Shy experiences that I haven't had and I find deeply uncomfortable. What one I think would be that he isn't. I haven't tried to create a teenage boy built purely from research into or encounters with teenage boys. I think one of the only ways he could work as an interesting character is that he is brought together. He is partly my grandmother. He's partly my mum. He's partly Kurt Cobain. He's partly, a grime MC from 2015, who I heard a throwaway interview with on the internet. I'm an extremely hungry people watcher. I borrow from wherever I can all the time, but at the service of his bespoke believability. Here's the truth that I'm trying to get at with him. So that's what I mean about being an editorial writer first and foremost. In order to get at him, I'm having to discard anything that is me, anything that is trite, anything that is attempting to be risque for the sake of it because I'm writing about a teenager, all the time applying the most rigorous editorial scrutiny to my efforts to create him, partly with a knowledge of what has come before in terms of the moral framework with which any one period would appear to be writing about teenagers from that period, for the usually very narrow moral climate of their time. And also, as we're knowing now, as we're finding out now from research about mobile phone usage and stuff, the era of the child is over. What we've called childhood for the last couple of 100 years is now no longer possible with mobile phones. Like that, we've lost that moment in a young person's life when they're able to do the things that they have been doing for the last couple of hundred years. So in a way, it's a sort of elegy. And therefore, one of my instincts was to resist anything broad strokes in terms of how children are these days. I wanted to just show how shy is these days. So unexpected tenderness that surprised me, unexpected violence, which I don't find easy or comfortable to write. I wanted to. I'm not one of these novelists that feels in control of his characters in a godlike way. I don't feel paternalistic or even I don't even feel I have the kind of superego of the singular superego of the creator when I'm making these characters. I like to be surprised and perplexed by them, and Shy really surprised and perplexed me. And I suppose that is connected to the textual stuff on the page, in as much as when I do anything like that for the sake of it, it's gone. I can't tolerate it. It revolts me because it's in the realm of the gimmick. It's in the realm of me trying to do something interesting so as not to appear to be or experimental so as to appear experimental. And I just don't think of books that way. My love of literature came out of children's books to such an extent that really I think it's how am I telling the story of this temper tantrum or this teddy bear's picnic or this child that makes a forest grow in his room every night with the help of the wild things. What are my tools to accurately evoke this thing? And I'm more of a children's book author than a grown-up novelist in that regard. So the only reason you have those pages of large text is because, in my experience of both being a teenager and now having teenagers and being a parent, is that when you are locked into that, both parents speaking at once, child covering his ears, barrage of futile disciplinary language. Why did you do? Reprimands and blackmail and sort of nonsensical thunderstorm of repetitive correctional language. How is that as a teenager? It's worse. It's worse than nothing. It's just type. It's just large, ugly, broken type on the page that goes over the borders. It doesn't even respect the mannerisms of literature. It's just
Right.
a wodge. It's just a slice of ugliness from both sides. So that was quite a carefully calibrated attempt to get to that. But that meant that other typographical things I'd wanted to do, like I'd wanted to have the voices of the badgers crawling along throughout as a kind of psychic taunt. I got rid of that because that was
Well,
me
and
trying to be
I should
clever.
interrupt. I should interrupt just so that listeners are along for the ride and say that Shy ends up like in his night walk at a pond where he encounters badgers,
Dead badgers, Brad.
dead badgers. Yeah, that's
Crucial
right.
distinction. I wasn't casting no living badgers in this show. Yeah, so those badgers were going to be throughout as a kind of taunt from the afterlife, as a kind of they were going to egg him on. They were going to clarify some of his thinking that he couldn't verbalize, and I got rid of them. I got rid of that because that felt like me trying to, I guess, crassly speaking, that felt like me trying to innovate. And that would have been for my sakes, or even my sake in relation to critical responses to my earlier books, or indeed a kind of innate ambition I have to push the form. None of that was relevant really when I wrote Shy. It was the most flow state novel I've written. It just was about him. When Shy was working, I was nowhere to be found. I was fully in him and in those around him. That's when the connection was strongest. Yeah. So I suppose I'm always going to go and try and find stylistic or formal solutions to strengthen that connection, whether it be with an invented crow or a mythical figure or the person I'm actually trying to evoke on the page. The life, death, physical reality, none of those things mean anything to me. To me, it's just what are the tools at my disposal to make this work on the page. And to work on the page, it has to be setting up an emotional rapport with the reader, who is pointedly and crucially not me. It's someone else with whom I'm going to collaborate with when I put this book into the world.
So I want to ask you about Last Chance. This is an institution in, I believe it's called West Country, the West Country of England. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it is basically a school or an institution for delinquent boys or troubled boys. And some of the most endearing moments in your book involve the people who work there and take care of these boys and work with these boys and try to help them. I'm curious to know, like, how it came to you imaginatively. I'm imagining that it's connected to some of the volunteer work that you talked about earlier, but you just talk about Last Chance and the people who work there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've just turned this book into a film, and the film is about those people. It centers them. The book is a love letter to people that do usually badly paid work in the social care sector or in the educational sector. So we would be usually we're talking about the state school sector. So not in this country we're hideously, as you all know, inequality is this country's modus operandi, and therefore we have a private educational sector that caters for 6% of the population, and the rest is in understaffed, underfunded, physically crumbling buildings. And the teachers there will often be extraordinary, dedicated people. So that's a simplistic moral formulation, but usually holds true. And I don't want to write them as heroes. They're deeply fallible people, of course, and that's what the movie is about. But basically, the situation at Last Chance is that it would have been an experimental institution where children who had broken the law enough, significant illegality, would, instead of being sent to a borstal, is a borstal an American? Do you have that in American parlance?
What's the word?
Borstal, like a junior prison.
Oh yeah, we call it juvie.
Juvie, yeah. So rather than being sent to juvie, you would be sent to this experiment, which is a school where there'll be very few children, and it will be an attempt to get you some kind of qualification, some kind of education, or with a therapeutic process built in. So at least once or twice a week, these kids are going to see a therapist in the school. Crucially, they're not at prison, and crucially, they are free to go anytime they want. They don't have to be there. So, and schools like that did exist. Sometimes, I think, unfortunately, we have to face the fact that those schools were very often sites in which various different forms of emotional and physical abuse was allowed to flourish. I guess like convent schools or boys' boarding schools, that certain types of behaviour are able to exist there that couldn't elsewhere. So that's a sad fact. And the other sad fact would be that in the long period of conservative rule prior to the 1997 Labour election victory in this country, most of those sorts of schools were defunded and shut down. So it's an elegy for that kind of ambition to do something progressive, and also the funding, because it costs about £30,000 a year per child to run that school in 1995. And so when you look at those numbers, if you're an educational trust, you're probably going to go and put your money into something easier. And let alone the conservative ideological complaint, which is why are we spending more money on badly behaved teenage boys than we are on kindergartens or swimming lessons for my child or whatever it is. So it becomes a battleground for warring social and political aims. And I wanted to show that battleground is always hardest for the people that are doing the work, and it's a thankless task, but also in among the extraordinary physical violence, linguistic violence. I mean, this is 1995, so inevitably and unfortunately, it's a site of almost relentless, rampant homophobia, sexism, fat phobia, etc., etc. But in amongst that, jostling right up against that in a kind of Max Porter juxtapositional literary fabric style is unbelievable tenderness, astonishing sort of proto sophisticated social intuition the boys have. They are able almost invisibly to handle hugely complex differences between them in terms of race class. Crucially, in the UK, everything is always class, gender, cultural specificity, music, the kind of tribal nuances of 1990s pop culture, and they're brilliant. So I wanted to just suggest that whilst it's the hardest work these people ever did, and they're all on their on their knees with the physical and emotional strain of this place, that it is also a miraculous, a site of really, really extraordinary humane behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, I think, in tandem with that, an examination of masculinity and the ways in which society is failing men and boys
Mm.
in particular. It's failing women too, but in this particular story and at this particular school, it's boys, right?
Yeah, I didn't want to undermine the greater effort, which is to show the way society is failing women. But I think one of the ways I can honour that as someone that has been a boy is to write well about the way it's failing men, and hope that that has some implications, or some, possibly even some kind of diagnostic relevance to the ways in which we're failing women later. So the ways that the kind of sociopathology of teenage male behavior curdles into actual violence against women, or into everyday sexism at a linguistic level, I think is of interest to those of us that are feminists, either domestically in the raising of our children, or as teachers or educators, or carers or whatever, or as people just trying to move a poisonous and poisoned patriarchal society in a better direction rather than a worse one. So, like, taking this book on the road for a year was really fascinating, because, you know, more often, I thought when I wrote this book, people would ask me about the alien visitation that occurs 2/3 the way through, and Shai imagines what aliens would ask him about living in the end times, and I thought people would ask about Vonnegut and then the Anthropocene and human responsibility to the notional planet cosmic other, and that came up not at all, because I think that's very easy to ingest and comprehend as a reader. But what came up a lot was Andrew Tate, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, these toxic archetypes, that despite our great learning, despite our apparent progress, particularly in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, in terms of the language of feminism, or deconstruction of misogynistic tropes in our society and in our language, how are these men now running the world again, flourishing, unchecked? And what are the implications now for the ways that language is so embedded in the forms of communication that young people use in the social media world and everything like that? And oddly, it took me to write a novel set in 1995 to really crack those questions open for myself and others. So it's really interesting and very, very different in different countries. Like, the diagnostic impulse towards Shai, as with Lanny, my previous novel, was strongest in America, which I thought was interesting. The problem of the kind of cancel culture aspect of you can't talk about boys and stuff was reared its head most in American conversations.
So wait, just so I'm clear, like people in America pushed back against what?
People in America would keen to put a label on him more than in the UK. Is he autistic? But also a sense, I think, probably a little bit more in America, that perhaps a conversation about boyhood or about boys was being neglected in because of conversations about gender or class or race elsewhere, which meant that the kind of elephant in the room of potentially, even in the UK, maybe more than in America, white working class male suicide epidemic or male unhappiness. In America, I think that there was a good book about boys and men published in America when in the year that Shai came out. Richard Reeve, is it? But the conversation was more about why it wasn't being given any mainstream space, as the question of boyhood, the question of masculinity, that was more prevalent in American discussions. I suppose also the fundamental differences between our societies in terms of teenage male rage came up a lot. The question of guns, I suppose, the kind of paradigm of the Columbine, and what the cultural influences were, but what the sheer realpolitik differences were between a male rage expressed with weapons and a male rage expressed in a kind of futile, kind of cul-de-sac of music and self-harm that Shy epitomizes. So yeah, I mean, it's not my job as a novelist to draw any findings from that particularly, but it was interesting, and I always, I went to Finland to publicize this book, and a lot of men came over and said there was no space when I was a young man to talk to other men about feelings. That was not a thing that occurred. My grandfather would drive me 300 miles after school every Friday to spend the weekend in his cabin, and I don't remember ever exchanging a word with him. And so Shy is a revelation in terms of communication of anger and unhappiness, and also futility, like to give a language to the noise, to the barbed wire buzzing absence of language. So yeah, it was interesting to take it on the road, this one.
Well, they're big questions that you're asking. It's like the question of how all of these toxic archetypes, as you put it, are kind of running the world again. And there's this resurgence of, bad men. And also this epidemic of mental health crises across the board, but in particular among young men. Like, why? What's going on in our
Yeah, it's funny,
societies
isn't it? Yeah.
that's causing all of this? And if you could solve it, I think, like you said, there would be positive benefits to be derived for everyone, men, women, kids, the whole thing.
Yeah, and I'm not one of these people that necessarily thinks that art can save the world in any clear and obvious way, but I do think I do believe, or I put great store in what people increasingly speak of here, and when we're talking about ways we could reform this, or ways that we might break the stranglehold of the military-industrial complex on the imagination of young men, or whatever it is. I do think that artists and writers have a responsibility to at least be regreening the woodland, to be used to find alternative stories. There are, particularly as regards, I would say, particularly as regards strength, ideas of strength and virility and aggression and empowerment, superiority. Basically, the kind of connection between white supremacy and masculinity as a storytelling norm is so fucked, and is so unhelpful and so counterproductive for a compassionate continuation of the species. Like it literally, it kills the earth as well as each other. I'm hugely influenced by a book I read that I bought in one of the great bookshops local to you. I say local, it's probably like a 9-hour drive, but a Point Reyes bookshop outside San Francisco.
Okay, yeah,
Stephen
that's about
Sparks is
6 or 7 hours away, but up close.
it's local for you, right?
Yeah, right.
But Stephen Sparks' bookstore. I bought a book there by a French psychoanalyst called Anne Dufour. I can't quite remember her name, Dufour-Natel or something. But it's called The Power of Gentleness. It was on Stephen's recommended table, and it is about gentleness redescribed, reformulated, repurposed, and redeployed as strength, as a pro-choice decision. That compassion as a force, both in relation to conventional physical force, or the power of violent ideas and or violent practices, but also as a pacifism, as the harder choice, as the more difficult, as the more manly indeed
Right.
choice, as the stronger, harder decision. And I think a sort of a re-education, a reseeding of ideas early in life, particularly you'll know this, raising a child that is neurodiverse, I don't know how you would quite describe it, how any of us would describe it, right? But I think that's the responsibilities we have, to think outside of the inherited language of normal and other, whether it's educational or race or gender or whatever it is, how easy it is to queer the pitch or to redesign or to use a different pronoun or to formulate for our children a completely different space. It's easy. And it's only a kind of a laziness or a subservience to the kind of rampancy, the sort of zombification that capitalism entails, that we just go along with it. So I think I'm someone that feels pretty despairing a lot of the time, but actually the speed of change, particularly among young people at the moment, in terms of the language of resistance and non-Western or non-mainstream ways of formulating change, environmental change, or change in the language around trade or the responsibility of one living thing to another living thing in the food chain is just so exciting. And so, yeah, I think writers should be and probably have a moral duty to be really interested in that. That work in the mulch, in the common nutrient bed, which is language. I've garbled what I'm saying there, but yeah, that's what when you write a book and you don't realize what it's about until later. It wasn't until I was on the road with Shy that I realized that that's what it had been about for me. Is an almost manic anxiety about what ideas we're giving to the kids to use against and for one another. That the thing that always comes to my mind is the Beastie Boys LP for the Sure Shot. I think it was for Sure Shot, has the kid on wearing a very similar kind of pair of headphones, actually, sitting on the sofa, and he's holding up the LP and he's saying, and the speech bubble says, "Ma, what are they giving me?" And that kind of, like, as a consumer going, what is this shit? But as a child of consumer society, what is this? But also the kind of complaint and the entitlement of it. I just think it's a brilliant 8-word satire, 4-word satire.
Well, I can imagine. I mean, I think I read when I was prepping for this conversation that you mentioned earlier you have teenagers. I think you have teenage boys too, right? You're a father of sons.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it makes us some sense that this would be on your mind as you're raising boys in this world and trying to do a good job of it, that you would have this stuff on your mind.
Yeah. And yeah. What seems to happen to me is that I'm a little bit ahead. The books I'm writing are a little bit ahead. So I wrote the book about the 2 children losing their mother when my children were much younger than that. And then I wrote the Lanny about the sort of 10, 11-year-old boy going missing when my children were younger than that. And now I've skipped ahead again to do this teenage boy, which means, of course, that what happens when the behaviors appear that are familiar to me from my own work or from my work with other children, rather than having any kind of insight into it, I'm reminded that novelists are just as useless as everyone else.
Right? Didn't help.
I'd say I have even fewer answers, because right in front of me is this immense blockage that how could I have written a book about this and still be raising my voice at my child. Anecdotally, I have this thing that happened to me where my son came down with it, clutching his phone, as he always does. He's attached to his phone like all of them, and he started to talk to me about the Rothschild global Jewish banking conspiracy, and I freaked out immediately without even letting him finish. And I was so appalled to hear anti-Semitic tropes being used in my house, and I was so upset, and I felt so frustrated at myself to have just let him free on the internet with no security or no checks. I felt so negligent in terms of what I had prepared him for, in terms of what he would find on the internet. And he just listened to me lose my shit for a couple of minutes, and then he was like, "Dad, I'm reading about conspiracy. I'm reading about conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and I came down to talk to you about how shocking and upsetting it is that for many hundreds of years the same tropes are being." He was coming down to have an intelligent conversation with me, and I just flipped my fucking lid, and I felt really ashamed and was like, "Come on, man!" like Shy's therapist says, do your breathing, count to 5, right. Breathe out, count to 5.
Right.
Like physician, heal thyself.
Yeah, it's easy though. It's easy to think that kids could be I worry about that. In fact, my daughter's school just yesterday issued an announcement that they're banning phones from school, or they're going to do a pilot program where they don't
Great.
allow them. And I was
Yeah.
like, fantastic, because
Yeah.
I'm like the grumpy parent who won't let her have social media, and we're at the
Yeah.
point where she's lobbying me to let her have it, and I won't budge. And
Listen,
now,
if you've got the opportunity to do it, Brad, do it, because it needs a critical mass, right? It needs enough parents in the class that are doing it so that your child doesn't become ostracized, right? We
right,
couldn't.
exactly.
It's too late. We didn't. We never. We only had like one or two parents who sort of floated it on the groups. It's like, should we try this? And everyone's like, nah, too late. My kid's got a phone. So if you can do it, do it.
Yeah, I'm
I
trying.
mean, the
I'm trying to
evidence
hold
that
the line. I'm losing my wife though on Snapchat. You know,
she'll come
I'm
back when it
trying.
crashes.
Yeah, hopefully, but I can't talk about your novella without talking about music.
Mm,
You've touched on it a couple of times, but music is so central to this book. I mean, it's on the cover. There's a great photograph of an old school cassette tape, the
mm.
Walkman, which I think younger readers might not even have cultural context for. But guys like you and me, this was the lifeblood, right? Mixtapes and
Yeah,
cassette tapes. I was listening to cassette tapes into the late 90s, early 2000s. I think that was when it ended for me. But I was like,
right.
I felt like I hung on. I love a cassette tape. You could do anything to a cassette tape. Like you could spill like beer on it. You could, it could freeze. It would still work. And
Well, I would keep
uh,
it. Also, I would keep it in the thing, and then I would listen to pirate radio stations at night, and I would just have it ready to record. So I would make myself mixtapes from what was being played on the radio. Some of that music wouldn't appear in the record shops for months or years, or never,
right.
because it was a white label that the DJ would have. So I would have these exclusive mixes that I would then copy and give to my friends, and then I would do incredibly careful drawings and writing and like really beautiful, illustrated inlays for the tapes with stickers and painted art. Well, it was a work of art, my mixtape.
I mean,
Um,
the
yeah,
little teenage girls in your life must have loved your mixtapes.
tell you what, it's how I wooed my wife. I made
I'm
her a
not
couple of
surprised to hear
mixtapes.
that.
They were mixtapes at the level of art. They really were, because
Mm,
they would have internal moods. Yeah, that's
I did that stuff. I
something
did
that
that stuff
modern
too.
people just wouldn't get. But also, like I remember wearing out around about the time that Shy is living in. I wore out my cassette version of Portishead's Dummy because I must have listened to it, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times till it snapped or broke or just didn't, and I love that. I love the idea of the physical use of something. Like when you see a gate that's been worn down by someone leaning on it, or stone steps in a cathedral that have got thousands of years worth of footprints on it. There is something. There is, this. We are obviously of our generation when we bemoan this fact, but there is something about the lack of physical trace in the digital world that means it doesn't register with us emotionally. There must be a relationship between the physical usage of something, pressing down of buttons, physically finding your place in an album. That is means more. I think it must mean more. I'm certainly not demeaning or belittling the young people's experience of music now if they've only ever known digital. But I am very much. I'm a Xennial or whatever it is. I had an analog childhood, and I'm
Me too.
so thankful for it
Yes, I say
in
this all the
so many
time, and
different ways.
yeah, I like. I'm not a Luddite. I think that sometimes technology can be great. It does a lot of things for us, and I know that change is the only constant. So I'm not digging in my heels and saying I want to go back to the time of vinyl only. But I do believe that like the experience of music when you would go to the record store and get an album and really engage with the album as an entire unit, like an entire
Mm,
artistic expression. And you would really read through the liner notes and hold the physical
mm.
object, as you say. To me, that is objectively better than the experience of music that
Yeah,
we get from streaming. It's
yeah.
so ephemeral, and it's all track by track, and you don't really engage with the art or the artist in the way that you used to. I mourn that.
Yeah, it was so profoundly exciting, and it was so. We worked so hard for it. We worked so hard to earn our pocket money, and we went and going to the record store was. I mean, we fetishize it now rightly, I think, because it was a high point. I think it was, particularly I think in the early to mid '90s. I think analog music culture was it was a bit like Renaissance painting in the Quattrocento. It was a wonderful thing that civilization did. And the care, as you say, the attention into the formats and the artwork and the lyrics and the sense of involvement that you got as a consumer was really special compared to some of the more exploitative or disposable modes of content imbibing now. And I
No
don't think
doubt.
I don't think we're being nostalgic. I think that's just got to be just accepted as true. You know,
Mm. Well, I mean,
like the
and
same
music
way as when
plays.
you had to cut a movie physically with scissors and glue it back together, there was a different attention to movie making. People thought about the edit very differently than they do now with digital. That's just a fact, and that's not. I don't think it's better or worse. It's just a great change, and I think it we should all be being analytical about what is being lost, what is being gained. Like our gratitude for what is being gained should be set against a sort of ongoing mourning for what is lost. Like that's good. I think it's a very human thing, and it's one of the things that literature does especially well, I think. And you know, yeah, I used to get the little semicircular grooves inside a CD case that would hold the sleeve in, that would hold the liner notes in, and you had to somehow
Yeah.
you had to get it out sometimes, and it would damage the paper to get it out. I sometimes remember in a really fetishistic way, these little tiny physical things that were so common to us all. It's good. It's beautiful because it's gone. It's over.
Well, it's definitely, music is definitely crucial to Shy in this book and into his way of dealing with reality and understanding the world and his emotional world. It's drum and bass music, and I actually had to. I'm so not hip. I had to Google Junglist. Am I pronouncing that right? Junglist.
Junglist,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. So he's super into drum and bass music. He wants to start a record label with one of his friends at school. This is like central to his existence.
Yeah, so I'm glad if I've been your gateway drug, Brad, to 90s drum and bass. It was an extraordinary moment because it was the result of multiple different traditions merging, house music and sound system culture and reggae and ragga and hardcore and jazz, and so it was a sort of diaspora moment in terms of multicultural Britain's best self, the Britain that was an extraordinary melting pot of different cultural traditions, but it was a homegrown sound. It was a UK sound. It would have been like grunge in Seattle in the '90s. It was our sound, instantly recognizable, hugely popular around the world. But as Shai says in the book, comes from small town Britain, unglamorous, shitty
Right.
small towns in Britain. So I not only wanted him to love that, and I could write about that because I wasn't as singular as Shai was. I had more eclectic tastes, but I could write accurately about why he loves that sound and what that sound is. But then I really the sense of it sounding like the future, the sense of it sounding like, and I think it still does. And that being a place where he could hide and have some sense of identity that wasn't it can't be contested because he has such a personal rapport with that sound. It is where he locates. He can put his depression and he can put his joy and his sense of belonging to a team literally in the physical spaces of that two-step break with the aim and break. And the bass line is his hope. So therefore, when I accepted that would be the kind of iconographical trappings of the book, when I edited the book, I thought, well, why can't I also make it the physical and structural, like architectural mapping of the book as well? So then I was like, okay, then the book needs to have a bass line, and the book needs to have this ornamentation in the roof, like the break, which is the therapist and the thingy and the repetitive bum jokes from the boys and everything. But ultimately, it steps along at 170 BPM, and that is Shy. That's Shy's heartbeat, and that's Shy's progression to the pond. It's his footsteps. So it felt like I was writing a novel in logic, where I would be programming it with the top of the beat, and then so what I was saying to you earlier, my kind of juxtapositional fiddlings became musical rather than literary at a certain point, and that's something I really strive for in all my work is a musicality, an inherent musicality. Like whether the book is about, even if I'm writing about maths, I hope that the musicality will be there. In fact, especially if I'm writing about maths,
Right.
because they're the same thing, right? But
That's right.
I strive for it, and I want patterning, and I want things that I'm placing that, like a cathedral builder. I hope I'm doing things in the roof of the building that no one will ever see, but I know they're there, and they are there as almost a gesture of my faith in the novel, as a vehicle, as a shared but private, sacred vehicle for my thoughts, and my faith in others. Like I suppose it's like a sort of the music, writing about music and doing it, threading the music in, further takes it from a series of private encoded thoughts that I've had that are very specifically for my literary community, and becomes something universal that can be felt by anybody reading it anywhere. I think even potentially in other languages, like the conversations I have with my translators about how to get that feeling in it of the bass line and the rat-a-tat tat tat tat, and the kind of sense of an uplift and uplift and uplift and uplift and a break, and then everything comes tumbling down, and like how to do that in Hungarian. It's fascinating.
Right. Right. Yeah, no. I mean, it's hard to think of a book that I've read in recent memory that is more musical on the page than this one. I mean, that's definitely the way that I would describe it. And
Oh, good.
a second ago, as we were talking about mixtapes, you talked about drawing elaborate visual art, for the mixtapes that you would create, and writing the liner notes and everything. And in my prep, I learned that you, as a writer, tend to begin your various books visually. You draw something
Yeah.
that will usually give you a kind of framework for the story that ensues. Is that right?
Yeah, I just actually got delivery this week of this book. Shall I hold it up and show you?
Sure,
Because
please.
it's right here. In fact, I'm such a cliche. Look here, I have a book called The Cosmos in Stone, about sacred geometry in cathedral building, and this book called The Work of Art by Adam Moss. Do you know him?
I don't know.
He was an editor at the New York Magazine, or the New Yorker. It's conversations with artists of all different kinds, like Barbara Kruger, Michael Cunningham, Moses Sumney, Sophia Coppola, Louise Gluck is in it. Composers, architects, sculptors, Sheila Hetty's in it, some fashion designers, and everybody talks about their process. And it is really, like, I would really recommend this to listeners, particularly of your podcast, actually, because you kind of get into the craft of things a lot. And I know you talk about structure and things like that, and how to build a thing. And it's amazing about the extent to which accidents and wrong turns and abandoned projects and neglected ideas end up being the work that is most interesting, or that you progress with. My piece in this is called Itchy Little Breakthrough, and it's about the thing that you're going to sleep and you can't stop thinking about it, and it's not right, and it bothers you and it bothers you, and you write it, and and then ultimately those those sort of irritations of the creative pathway are the things that yield the best and most generative results when you come to the page or to the drawing board or whatever it is. So yeah, this is full of I gave him a load of pages from my notebooks, because it's not that I draw particularly well. I'm not a fine artist, but I do need a time when I'm liberated from an economic commission. I haven't been told to do something. I'm in my own mind. I'm not trying to impress or earn or win or anything. I am simply sending images from my brain down my arm onto the page, and that is not just the essential part of the process, but I'd say the all the jouissance is located. Like it's where I can meet myself and find out if I have anything to say. And it'll be bad. Like I mean, some of the drawings, they're like schematic things, little diagrammatic things, just a figure or a skull or whatever. Just sometimes just arrows or little floor plans. Sometimes I'm as simple as that. Like if I'm writing a scene with two people, I want to just draw the floor plan. So I can think from a kind of directorial point of view, can he see her there? And if he's not standing there, what does it mean that he can hear? Where is he if he can hear her but not see her? It's as simple as that. Like I'm storyboarding, not because I'm stuck without it, but because it's something other than writing. It's a way to pause and let my to sort of let the instrument of my mind play a pure note or oil itself or something. So it's a long-winded way of saying I do draw. And Shy's one of the books I've drawn less for, actually. I just draw the one picture for Shy that was a boy in a pond with a backpack with the house behind him, and then I went and wrote it.
Well, it makes sense though that maybe you would need less visually for a book that has this much interiority in it.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that the time for drawing came after, really, with Shy. It's funny. I'm not a great believer in. I mean, as you'll glean from the way I speak about myself, I'm not a great believer of the author on a pedestal with any kind of unique set of skills that are different from. I think we're the same as everyone else, and possibly even less good than everyone else at handling things. But it's how we handle that mess. It's how we handle that lostness, and how we decide what to take out of the lostness with us. And one of the kind of coping mechanisms I have for that is to leave notes, is to leave a kind of Hansel and Gretel like trail behind me, so that when I'm lost, I can go back and find it. I find it really, really helpful. And I'm not a mathematically minded person. Other novelists I know are very good on the kind of super narrative or narrative arcs or sort of sense of, a sort of post-it world of complex plotting and stuff like that. And I'm not. I'm much more a kind of musical writer. I find my rhythm, I jam along with it, really. Like I'm like that embarrassing guy with the, who plays on the box with the snare, sitting in the square, jamming out to my own private session. But I nevertheless, because of that kind of improvisational musical side of me, I have to build in the rigor in other ways. And having a lot of pre-matter or sort of irrelevant side matter is one of the ways I can do that.
Well, it's been great talking with you. And before I let you go, I just want to make sure to underscore something that you mentioned briefly earlier. There is a film adaptation of Shy that I believe you are collaborating on with Cillian Murphy. Is that right? It's called Steve.
Yeah, I wrote it for him. Yeah, we've done a few things together. I wrote him a short film in lockdown. He did the theatrical adaptation of my first book with Enda Walsh. And so he said, let's do something longer. And this book was still really unfolding itself to me because as I said, I'd taken it on the road, and the people that stood up at these events and said, I do this for a living, or I retired last year having done this for 45 years and I'm very, very, very tired, but my God, I love those boys and your book made me cry, or whatever it is. A sense of what it is actually about was the teachers. So I set about rebuilding the book from the point of view of the teacher, Steve. And
that's who Cillian Murphy will play Steve.
Yeah. Fairly well would be my guess. I think he'll do a stand-up job. I mean, the guy's had a terrible year. He's completely disappeared off the map. Yeah, I really feel for him. What a dismal appearance he put in this year.
Well, I'm glad you're giving him an opportunity. I mean, it's just good for him.
Throwing him a bone, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And then in terms of next books, I always ask my guests at the end of our time together if they're working on anything new. You seem like somebody who tends to have a project going. Is there another book in the pipeline?
What I do, and I probably one day should have, I don't have a therapist, but probably I might one day treat myself to an hour of really good therapy. Maybe I'll do it when I'm in New York or something, and ask someone to explain this to me, or at least unburden myself of this tendency. what I do is I have a book I want to write, and I tell everybody I'm writing that book, and I have no intention of writing that book because I'm too scared of writing that book. So I don't even start the reading that I need to do to write that book because I'm not ready. I'm not grown up enough, or I'm not brave enough, or whatever it is. But that's the project that I tell everyone to do, and then I start secretly writing something else. But yeah, the official answer is I want to write a book about William Gladstone, the great British 19th century Prime Minister, because he was a good man. And I'm interested in the category of good British politician and why that seems such an impossible thing in our current age, and where that would spring from a kind of social reform point of view, but also as a moral category, like to be a good guilty, because guilt is never far away from the British project, particularly from a colonial point of view or an empire point of view. So is it possible to be a good man when you're drenched in blood? So yeah, that's about
I'm excited to hear you say this, because I feel like those kinds of thoughts and that kind of creative impulse is in sync with the times. I think a lot of us are asking these questions about moral clarity and what that means.
Yeah.
And also, like you say, what does it mean to be a good human? And can there be a good politician? Like, can there even be somebody who takes on a position
aren't they
of leadership?
Mutually exclusive categories? Yeah, the good man and the politician.
Yeah. I mean, it's on my mind, so I'll be excited to read it when it.
Have we debased one so thoroughly that it's not possible? Yeah. Well, also it would probably be my book about trees. Trees are my religion, and trees are never far from my thoughts. And I think there's a way of doing both books at the same time, because Gladstone had a very interesting relationship with trees. So yeah, but that's the big project I tell people I want to do, and then I'm sure another one will just pop out. I just wrote a thing for radio, and I'm doing a lot of collaborations with musicians and stuff. So I'm keeping pretty busy. 3 boys, the boys are keeping busy.
I was going to say, you got a lot going on, but it all sounds like good stuff. And I'm deeply appreciative of you taking some time to talk with me. Congratulations on Shy
pleasure,
and on all that you have going.
Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure to speak with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, you guys, there we have it. That was today's conversation with Max Porter. His latest novel is called Shy, available in trade paperback from Graywolf Press. You can find out more about Max on the internet at maxporter.co.uk. Follow him on Twitter. Once again, his book is called Shy. It is out there right now wherever books are sold. It is waiting for you. Go get your copy right away. Don't forget to subscribe to this show wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Bluesky. I would love it if you signed up for my newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. Join the Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. If you have 2 minutes, please give this show a rating and write a little review if that's possible. It'll help the show in the rankings. It'll help it find new listeners. If you want to get an Other People t-shirt or join my book club, do that over at the show's official website, otherppl.com. And if you want to read my latest book, it is a novel called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook. So go get my book if you want to get my book. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. All right, so coming up on Friday, there will be a new flashback episode. There's a lot going on the program right now. I don't know if you've seen this, but I'm testing out some new content options. So maybe there's something happening on Thursday. I don't even know yet, but you should be seeing new episodes in the feed. Friday remains Flashback Friday, so there will be a flashback coming your way in just a couple of days. Stay tuned.